Welcome to Fun and Fundraising, everybody. The podcast where we talk with people behind top nonprofit galas and signature fundraisers to showcase how they positively transform their communities. I am your host, Rob Giardinelli, and today I'm really excited to have Dan Perry on as a guest. Dan Perry is the development director for the Lyndon Baines Johnson Foundation. They recently hosted an event called the With Liberty and Justice for All Dinner, which is an annual event. And this year, they actually did something really cool. They announced a new program and they got to honor a cultural icon that pretty much everyone in Texas and beyond knows, pretty much by the sight of a first name, not even a full name. So I'm really excited to talk with Dan about it. So Dan, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Rob. Glad to be here.
Awesome. So, let's start a little bit about, the Lyndon Baines Johnson Foundation, which is also known as the LBJ Foundation. So I'll call it that going forward. So tell us a little bit about the mission of the LBJ Foundation.
Well, the LBJ Foundation was set up in 1971 when the library opened, and it was after LBJ's presidency. And he really did two things with the foundation. One was to start the first School of Public Affairs, Graduate School of Public Affairs in Texas, the LBJ School for Public Affairs at University of Texas at Austin, and also the library, which serves as a library that holds 45 million records of his archives, and the museum that delves into the legacy and history of the Johnson administration. And if you know about the Johnson administration, there's really a lot that happened in those 5 years with all of the legislation he passed around Medicare to National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities to the Higher Education Act, the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act. The list goes on and on. It's pretty incredible. And of course, also the Vietnam War, which was a major event of that time as well. So it's a really rich museum. The mission of the foundation is to support those two entities. And so we support the programming that happens at the library, which there is a distinguished speaker series that happens 9 months out of the year, bring in journalists, people who've been involved in politics to talk about public affairs issues of the day, and that happens approximately monthly. It's a membership-based event series. And then there's the Future Forum, which is more, it's also a speaker series, but it's more locally focused on issues of Texas and Central Texas. And we do some special events around certain topics. We've done a Civil Rights Summit and a variety of summits and other topic-based issue areas. And then the museum, which has the full Johnson administration museum, plus some temporary exhibits. Like right now, we have an exhibit on the Lorax, because when that was written, the archives for all of the original drawings for the Lorax were given to us. And another one that's on Lady Bird Johnson specifically. And then with the school, we fund fellowships for graduate students, and some of the typical things around supporting the research centers, faculty positions, and the Washington, D.C. Center, where graduate students can go to live in D.C. and study there for a year.
I will say one thing. If anyone ever feels overwhelmed trying to put a collection or an archive together, just imagine what you have to do with a presidential archive. And especially, LBJ was president in the 60s, and that was a time kind of before computers. So everything was documented on a piece of paper. And and I've had the good fortune of going into that many times over the years. And I am always overwhelmed and awe-inspired by, one, how beautiful the space is, but two, how thoughtful and careful both the permanent exhibits are, and then also the rotating other exhibits that are, political, but they're also cultural. Like I remember one time, there was one kind of on like the history of Motown that was on, and Mary Wilson came in from the Supremes before she passed away. There really is a full wide range of programming that you all offer that, yes, politics is obviously part of it and celebrated, but you all also really do such a good and thoughtful job of celebrating culture as well. And I just wanted to make that aware to everyone who's listening.
Yeah, and I think that's an important part. I think a lot of people who grew up in Austin think about it as a museum where you've gone there, learned about the Johnson administration, and and that's what there is in terms of exhibits. But as you said, we have rotating exhibits that are changing out all the time. Every 6 months, we have a new temporary exhibit. So we really do focus on bringing content back that is going to continue to engage the people who come to the museum, and we have over 100,000 visitors a year. So there's a lot of a lot of people come in from out of town as well as locally to the museum.
Absolutely. And, talk a little bit about how you, we talked a little bit about this before, we hopped on the air here, but tell us about how you got involved with the LBJ Foundation.
Sure. So I started actually fairly recently, February of 21st of this year, 2023 was my first day. I came from actually, interestingly, LBJ's alma mater, Texas State University, which was Southwest Texas State Teachers College, I believe, when he went there. And so he, was our most famous alumnus. We talked a lot about how Texas State was the only university in Texas to have a graduate of the university as a president. But I'd been there 10 years and I found out about this position. And I'm just somebody who's always been interested in public affairs. I have a master's degree in international relations and studied social policy as an undergraduate. And the Johnson administration and the Great Society was always intriguing to me, just in the sense of, when you think about how can we make the world a better place and impact people's lives with, whether it's with financial investments or with policy. As I mentioned, so much in the Johnson administration continues to affect the lives of Americans today. Tell you a little story. I had somebody come to the library. Actually, somebody who had come to our gala came into town the other day and took her through the museum, and we were talking in the domestic policy section about that fact, that so much of what was done back then is still a foundation of some of the programs we have. And as we said that, somebody who was in the museum turned, and he was a teacher who was bringing a Head Start group of students from Chicago to Austin to visit the museum. And he was clearly touched by what he was seeing. Head Start was one of the programs that the
Yeah.
Johnson administration started. And he said, it's so impactful for these students to see that Johnson started the Head Start program, and that's what they're benefiting from. And just it was a moving moment, and it kind of resonated with just how important those programs continue to be.
Absolutely. And, I want to add to that, the Johnsons in particular, so much of anyone who either lives in Austin or comes to visit Austin, you see their footprints and their fingerprints all over this city. Like anyone who has ever walked on Town Lake, which is just a beautiful, gorgeous, several mile network of trails, that is all because Lady Bird Johnson really stewarded and spearheaded that, and that was happening right around the time that the library was opening in the early 70s. And one of the reasons people find Austin so majestic is because of the things that the Johnsons did 50 years ago that still people love and come back to decade after decade, and what makes Austin such a desirable city for so many.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, obviously the town lake was renamed for Lady Bird Lake in her honor. And I think that she is so beloved locally for the Lady Bird Wildflower Center. And like you're saying, as much as she did to sort of beautify and contribute to conservation in the city. And it's a great place to live for that reason, although I know that Austinites would not want me to say that. On the air, but
and that's okay. We got people not from Austin that listen, so we're all good
yeah,
there. So,
sure.
so I want to talk a little bit about, the gala, and, but before we go into kind of the details and the specifics of the gala, what is just so amazing about what you all did this year was you basically announced something new, and it tied in with a milestone of a cultural icon. So talk a little bit about the new endowment, why it was
Yeah.
created, and who it's named after.
Yeah, so we knew we were going to give the LBJ Liberty and Justice Award for All to Willie Nelson, and it was actually the idea of the dean of the LBJ school, J.R. DeShazo, to create the endowment, the Willie Nelson Endowment for Uplifting Rural Communities, and to give it a purpose that aligned with the work that, and really as a way to honor Willie Nelson for the work that he did around Farm Aid. If you are familiar with uh, that music series and the number of times he's played benefit concerts to benefit farming communities and farming families. Farm Aid raised over $70 million over all the years that he's contributed to it. So this award, obviously, there's what he's done as an artist, which that in and of itself merits recognition. But the award itself actually was mostly recognizing the work that he's done for farming families, and through philanthropic and just the amount of time that he's given. And so the award generally in the past is given to people who are involved with politics, Ruth Bader, or justices, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, George H.W. Bush, Jimmy Carter. There's been a number of people who were a little bit more political in nature. It's the first time we've given it to a cultural figure. But the theme of the award is to people who, in LBJ's words, right wrong, do justice, and serve man. And so, that's really, I think, Willie Nelson definitely, fits with that. I think there was one other piece as we were thinking about choosing Willie Nelson, or as the board was in. That's, there's so many overlaps with LBJ as well. Both are Texans. Willie Nelson came from Texas, up by the Waco area, and never forgot where he came from. He's done a lot for Texas, a lot for Texas farming families. And so it was important for us to come back to Austin. It's the first time that we've given the award here in Austin, Texas at the library. Every other time since 2010, when it was created, it was in Washington, D.C. So that was something new about it. But the Willie Nelson Endowment for Uplifting Rural Communities is held at the LBJ School, and it's for the benefit of the work done at the LBJ School, supporting student fellowships, faculty research around rural communities, farming families, clean water, and issues like that.
And I think, one of the things that people will often ask me is they'll ask, how do I make the ask, with somebody to get them to say yes? And there has to be some sort of emotional tie. And I'm just so grateful that you explained, the similarities in the backgrounds of these two people. They both grew up in rural areas. They both grew up poor. They both, really wanted to pay it forward and back to those communities, really kind of as a mission, in their lives, as opposed to many other things that they were initiating and they were tied to. And, it's just the emotional tie is all about connecting the dots. And sometimes the dots are actually pretty obvious. And in this case, they're pretty obvious, but it also at the same time takes a certain amount of, it takes an amount of planning and an amount of courage to ask that, to get someone like Willie to say yes, and to show up. And, this also tied in with something special this year with Willie Nelson because he was celebrating his 90th birthday. So, and it was really within a week or two of his birthday. So, I mean, there was really so much to celebrate. And the fact that you all came home back to Austin and had it here really, really highlights just how special that evening was.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and actually, Willie Nelson and LBJ knew each other as well, so there was an element there. And some members of our board also served in the Johnson administration and knew Willie, and so there was, also a personal connection, I think, for Willie with the Johnson administration as well. So it was a fun event for sure. And I think, in terms of making the emotional connection, somebody said to me, well, shoot, you're fundraising for Willie Nelson. I mean, who doesn't love Willie Nelson? So, and honoring him on his 90th birthday or right around that time, a lot of people came out to honor him and gave, knowing that this was going to contribute to an endowment that would be benefiting an area that's meaningful to him. So.
Wow. So, I mean, that all sounds really amazing. I definitely kind of want to start to dive a little bit kind of more into kind of the event itself. So the first thing that I thought was, there's really two things that I find interesting here. One is that you started really 3 months before the event happened. But two, you have this additional layer of, this is really the first signature fundraising gala that you're doing. And it's not, yes, it's where you work and where you're based, but it's not where it usually is. So talk about what it was like to kind of come into that process, because that's a pretty, for someone who's, in development and asking for funds, that's a pretty tall order to do and to pull off. So I'd love to hear your thoughts and insights on, how you navigated that.
Yeah, it was interesting. Well, for one, the context of starting February 21st, we actually found out that that Willie Nelson was going to be available to accept the award on May 12th. On March 8th is when that date was set. We had thought it was going to be in the fall. And when I was interviewing for the position, there was conversation about it likely happening in the fall. But on my second week on the job was where we found out, no, actually, we have approximately 2 months to plan this event and carry it off. And so, that was obviously it was something where all of our attention shifted to the event. And I had people who, our colleagues in fundraising who said, how are you going to pull off a major event in 2 months? It just seems like
Exactly.
a tall order. But, one thing, and this is a lesson for me, one, it's an incredible team here. They do large events and have done a number of large events. Many of the people who work for the foundation have been here over 10 years, know each other well. There's a lot of trust in the team where each person knows their role. So they work together very effectively. I should say, for people who don't know, the foundation is only 9 people. So it's a small but mighty team. But even more than that, the vendor relationships and the trust with the vendors, I think, was critical. So we had already worked with the graphic design company on a number of other occasions, the event planning company and design company had already done other large events for us. And so, they actually started working on the event before the ink was even, dry or signed on the contracts. It was, everybody was ready to roll up their sleeves. We knew who we could go to. I think all those factors were critical in being able to pull off the event. We did, as you said, had a history of doing it in a different city, Washington, D.C. We didn't know how many of those relationships are going to carry over to a new market. We didn't know whether the sponsorship level, pricing essentially for the gala was going to carry over from that market. It's a different thing to do an event in Washington, D.C. for a political figure in some ways, in terms of who comes out to it, who's likely to sponsor, than it is to do it in Texas and Austin, Texas for a cultural figure. But we really saw, one, many of the funders who had been with us in Washington, D.C. continued to carry over to Austin. So, that helped a lot. And then we brought on some new funders. It was a great thing that we had our lead presenting sponsor was HEB, which, if you live in Texas, HEB does so much for Texas.
Absolutely.
Tito's Vodka, which, is also a large Texas brand. So, we really had a lot of Texas-based companies also come forward to sponsor this, and I think the Willie Nelson connection was strong for them, and the rural component to it. But I think the other big factor for us was the support of our board and some of the volunteers who'd been involved with doing this event in past years as well. So, as somebody who was brand new, I sort of came into this with a bit of a leap of faith that, that we'd been able to do this event and pull it off in a big way. And everyone seemed fairly confident that we were going to be able to do that. And, just learned how supportive many members of the board were, and reaching out through their own networks as well. And members of the LBJ School Advisory Council. So, we sold out the event, 560 people, every seat, more than every seat in some ways. We had to
I
add
bet
two
there.
tables to it in the end. But so it really was a team effort. And for somebody who's brand new, was an amazing opportunity for me to get to know the community of donors, and community of donors even who had not been involved with the foundation before, but maybe were involved with UT previously, and came out to this event. And so, yeah, it's been a great way to, trial by fire, as they say, but to get to know the organization, get to know the team.
Absolutely. So, I want to ask you a question, and that is, what is a piece of advice you would give to somebody who has to plan something on an accelerated timeline?
Well, hopefully you are walking into a template that, that is there to some degree. It's helpful a lot. I think that the other thing is, dealing with some of the potential ambiguity. We didn't know. We ended up having Eric Church, Sam Hunt, Elle King, and Lyle Lovett all perform at the event. That would have been great to know right up front on day one, to put into our materials, and to be able to advertise that out. Those names actually weren't finalized until sometime in April. So, it was a little bit of taking the information that we had at each time and going out, with what we had in the moment, and kind of leaning into the pieces that we did know, like the endowment, as communication points, as we were building, the sponsor base. Obviously, once we had the performers, we were able to go out for that communication. We got another boost in ticket sales. I think the other part was just, making decisions quickly. Is it, perfect is the enemy or good is I forget what the saying is.
Perfect
Perfect
is
is
the
the enemy
enemy of good.
of good, or something to that
Yeah.
effect. Yeah. Sort of, we had to, just work quickly to put the materials together. I think it took us about a week to design all of the sponsorship materials and send them to print, and put together the sponsor list. And normally probably would have taken longer, but when you've got 2 months, I sort of worked backward in my head and said, I've got a week to do this. We just need to start getting it out there and getting the word out. So,
Well, and what I love how you explain that, because there were a couple of things I picked up on it. One is that and we're not saying everyone plan an event out in 2 months, but when you kind of have to, when it goes from a 6 or 8 month timeline to a 2 month timeline, what it sounds like you did was, you had Willie and you had the draw up front, but then you had these other musicians that came in later on. It was, you had the initial momentum with Willie, and then you were able to build on the momentum later on with announcements of the other performers, to help maybe some people that were on the fence, who maybe like Willie Nelson, but also really like Lyle Lovett, to get them to kind of come over and say yes. Because yes, a lot of people are going to say yes right away, but there's also some folks that want to take their time and just kind of want to see how things unfold. And the more of it they saw, oh, it's going to really be, in addition to that, there's also going to be a show. It added a whole new element to it for you all that really just kind of built momentum. And I felt it here in the city, because when I was going to stuff, I would say the second half of April and that first week of May, I was hearing people nonstop talking about it, because they were really excited that this was happening, because it was kind of a once in a lifetime sort of thing to kind of have
yeah,
Willie in kind of that small of an environment, him be honored and have a concert with musicians that he had personal ties to. It was really,
yeah,
really just, the way you explain that was just really wonderful to just kind of see how one thing kind of built to the other, and it made it feel less overwhelming. And like you said, you don't really have time to second guess when you have a 60 or 90 day timeline that you do when you
hmm
have a 9 month timeline.
yeah. No, absolutely. Um, yeah, and the event itself did end up, being so special. I mean, it was the within the tent, we had 560 people, but we ended up doing under a tent outdoors, and it just felt like every seat in the house, you were close in to Willie, and um, I mean, the performances were phenomenal. The musicians were there to honor Willie as well. So there just was so much of an emotional, connection in for everyone who was there, honoring him and all he's done in his life. So
Well, and when that happens, there's also a lot more authenticity with that because sometimes, like, and all celebrity performances are really good and they're really fun at galas. But when you have that emotional tie, it just gives, from the musicians themselves, it just gives it an extra layer of warmth and an extra layer of heart within an event. And you just feel it
yeah,
throughout the room because I've gone to enough things that you can tell when things are good, but you can tell when the room is really speaking. And that having those elements with those musicians and with all those creatives, that makes that job for you all much easier to do that.
yeah, definitely. I
And
think the other, to the character of the event also, uh, I note to a lot of people who are thinking of it as a fundraising gala that it really wasn't actually primarily a fundraising gala, right? It was a gala to honor Willie Nelson. And the fundraising element to set up the endowment in his name was a part of honoring him. Clearly, it also benefited the school, which was within the mission of the LBJ Foundation. But at the event itself, and we had people comment about this, they said it was really a clean event in the way where there were pretty minimal, speeches. There wasn't really a pitch about the endowment. There was no paddles up or silent auction. We weren't trying to maximize the fundraising like you would at a normal gala that's fundraising for the operations, of a nonprofit or something where the nonprofit is counting on that. It was designed to honor Willie Nelson. And so most all of the event content was focused on what was going to honor him there that night, and less on the fundraising part of it.
and that's really important for people to know with donors, with nonprofits is, a lot of the time they feel courted all the time, that for them to just kind of have a night and a space to enjoy. I bet a lot of those donors probably were grateful for that. And then the next time you do come around and ask, whether it's for next year's gala or something else, they're going to remember how they felt in that space with Willie, and that it was just a night for them to enjoy, and they'll
Sure.
come back and they'll say yes in future years because you gave them that space to do that. I think that's really incredible.
Yeah, I think that the richness of the experience of being there that night. We've had a number of people who that was their first experience with the foundation. They said, we didn't realize that you did programming, and how can I get more involved and engaged with the programming that you do? And so it has opened the door for us to go back out to some of those donors and sponsors to talk to them about the other, programs that we offer and ways they can continue to engage.
Absolutely. And it's not just about making the ask, but it's also about knowing when to ask and kind of, allowing certain beats to play. And I just think you all did such a wonderful job with that. And one other thing I kind of want to dive into about the event is, so you had basically 5 big musical names. What is
Mhm.
a piece of advice you would give to an organization looking to do an event that has a lot of high profile talent, energy, personalities that are tied with it?
Yeah, I think one piece of that is obviously you're not just dealing with the artists themselves, you're dealing with the stakeholders around them. And so, there's with Willie, there's obviously his agent, his publicist, his family who were concerned potentially, around health concerns and just about him personally being 90 years old. So, and then layer that on with the other artists as well. It's you definitely have to be mindful of the communications we were putting out, running it through their team, And I think for the agent, for the family, for the publicist, for Willie Nelson, we were also creating this event in a way that was consistent with his who he is, and in some ways, I would say the Willie brand, right? But and I say that partly because for the table numbers when you walked in, you got a guitar pick that had Willie's face on it, and then the backside was the table number. The giveaway for the event was a red bandana that had Willie Nelson's face and LBJ's face, and then a variety of other things that had to do with the LBJ Liberty and Justice for All Award. And then the attire itself, which we told people was Hill Country Cocktail. And I've heard some of your other podcasts and people talk about attire, which if you're not saying, I think black tie is meaningful for everyone. They know exactly what that is, business attire. But when you say Hill Country Cocktail and you tell that to people who are coming in from Washington, D.C. or California, I got a lot of calls from people saying, "What is Hill Country Cocktail?" I said, well, just think of it as maybe Willie Nelson chic, sort of, but, have fun with it. Be creative. If you want to wear a suit, wear a suit. If you want to wear, cowboy boots and jeans and, a sport coat, do that as well. And so it ended up being just, be flexible, but understand that this is about building an environment that honors Willie, that he feels comfortable in, that is built around him and who he is. And I think that all of that partly went into, in some ways, building that confidence that we were going to, that he wasn't just coming in for us to have something or someone to fundraise around. It was really a genuine understanding that this was about honoring Willie for all he's done to serve farming families, and that it really is consistent with kind of LBJ and LBJ's legacy, and people who continue to carry forward that legacy.
Absolutely. And, it's fun when you were kind of explaining that, like, when you were talking about the program earlier, and it's like, you don't need to have a program with lots of speakers when you have such smart things like a guitar pick that everyone's going to take home, because that's something they can easily put in their pocket and they'll remember afterwards. They already know why they were there, especially if you've got these little things that are really pocket size. It allows you. So I love how thoughtful you all were in that you could bypass a lot of those program elements because you were so thoughtful in how the guests were being treated, so that they had a really good experience and that they'll want to come back and support the organization again and again.
Yeah. And it was all part of what made the event fun, right? And that's a lot of that credit goes to our event planning partner, to pull together that whole design. So.
Absolutely. And I have one more question, and it's on the subject of fun. So you had talked a little bit, a couple of times earlier about you have folks coming in from DC. So I always like going to events where there's people from multiple cities, because it just brings just different energy to an event. So in what ways do you think having people from multiple cities as guests in an event, how do you think it made it more fun?
Well, I think in some ways it brings up the energy, because it's not just another Thursday night gala that people are going to and then going back home. I mean, people are traveling in and making a full weekend of it. So people were planning their itinerary to do a special tour of the LBJ, museum, library museum here, and planning other activities while they were in town, getting dressed up, coming in as a group and organizing a table to get together, people who were from Washington, D.C. and knew other people who were here, maybe involved with the LBJ administration, who hadn't seen each other in years. And so I think for us particularly, there was that energy of reuniting, of making this really an occasion to celebrate. So.
Well, a celebration it was, and it's one of those nights that I know people will be, and I've heard people talk about it throughout the summer. It's one of those nights I think people will be talking about in Austin and probably elsewhere for a long time to come. So, Dan, thank you again for being a guest today, and congratulations on a wonderful event.
Thank you. This has been fun.
Absolutely. So for more information about the LBJ Foundation, visit lbjlibrary.org/foundation. And that will do it for this episode of Fun and Fundraising. I am your host, Rob Giardinelli, reminding you to keep it fun, keep it interesting, and your guests will have a great time. Have a great day, everyone, and take care.